Hi, I'm Hal Roberts. This is Bridge City News. Welcome. Here's some of the top stories we've been following. With their demands not being met, the leader of the Bloc Québécois says the wheels are in motion to try and bring down the Liberal government. A Calgary pastor charged and sentenced following his time at the Coutts border blockade reacts to his appeal being rejected. And the United Conservatives are meeting in Red Deer beginning Friday for their AGM. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson addresses some of the hot-button policy issues which may be discussed.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News with Hal Roberts.
Thanks so much for joining us. Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet says his party will vote down the Liberal government after it missed the deadline for passing Bloc legislation on old age security pensions and supply management. Blanche says time is up for the Justin Trudeau Liberals and his government.
We said 5 weeks ago that if we were not to receive that, if 4 million of Canadians between 65 and 74 years old were not to receive what we asked, if producers under supply management regime were not to get what we asked, we were to start discussing with opposition parties in order to have this government fall. And this is exactly what we are starting to do as of now.
Federal Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre asked Prime Minister Justin Trudeau if he will implement his policy idea of not charging GST on new homes under $1 million. During question period, Trudeau had some other ideas.
Today I came up with another common sense idea. Let me quote his housing advisor, Mike Moffat. The Conservative leaders plan to eliminate the GST for newly constructed homes selling for under $1 million is the boldest middle-class housing proposal released to date from any federal political party. Will he accept my common sense idea?
Canadians learned the hard way. With Conservative promises, you always have to check the fine print. And the fine print on this one is they're going to cut the investments we're making across the country, working with municipalities to cut red tape, to invest in more housing, to invest in more affordable homes, to accelerate permitting and create densification. He's going to cut the services and programs and investments that Canadians are counting on to solve this housing crisis.
Our country's government watchdog released details of how much it will cost Canada to meet NATO's promised military spending target by the year 2032. The parliamentary budget officer says Canada would have to double its defense spending to $81.9 billion to meet the target of member states spending 2% of their GDP on defense. Canada is one of the only 32 NATO allies that has not presented a plan to reach the target. At the June NATO Leaders Summit, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau said Canada would meet the spending target by the year 2032. The top court in Alberta has upheld the conviction of a Calgary pastor for his role in protesting COVID-19 public health measures. Arthur Pawlowski delivered a speech at the Coutts border blockade that was blocked for more than 2 weeks back in February of 2022. Pawlowski was found guilty of mischief and breaching a release order in connection with the blockade at the Alberta-Montana border. Arthur Pawlowski was given 60 days in jail, but didn't spend any time behind bars after receiving credit for time already served. Arthur Pawlowski of the Street Church joins us now from Calgary to talk more about his appeal being rejected. So Arthur, how does this really make you feel?
I am very saddened by the whole state of the so-called justice system in Canada. However, if you look at my life, every single time this horrible thing happens to me, it has a bigger purpose, including my imprisonment. I don't know if you know, but I wrote a book in prison telling the people the entire story. Lions Do Not Bow. It has become last week a bestseller on Amazon.com and .ca. And I'm telling the whole story, how it started, why I said what I said, the Get Out video, the lockdowns, the protests, the rallies, the arrests, imprisonment, house arrest, political, threats, political fixers, attempted bribery by the Alberta's government. All of those things are included in a book. And I think this is a retaliation because I'm calling out the judges. I've called them by name.
Now, prosecutors say during one of your impassioned speeches to truckers at Smuggler's Saloon back in 2022, you convinced them to stay on for another 2 weeks and to not break the line. Now, looking back, is there anything you would have changed? Any regrets?
No, absolutely not. I told them not to break the line, to hold the line. I told them to stand in solidarity with each other. That did not mean block the highway. It meant do not go anywhere else because the eyes of the world are fixed on you, on this sliver of little, pitiful looking land, if you will, Coutts. Whoever heard about Coutts, Alberta? And yet the whole world was watching what those brave men and women were doing, the farmers, the truckers, where they were fighting for their very lives, they were fighting for their careers, they were fighting for their children. So what I said to them is to stand to their convictions and to do it peacefully and to do it with God. That's the job of a shepherd, if you will. That's the job of a pastor.
Thanks so much for joining us today, Arthur. That was Pastor Arthur Pawlowski of Street Church joining us from Calgary. Oh, by the way, 3 of the organizers of the blockade who were also convicted of mischief over $5,000 will be sentenced in January. They're Marco van Hugenbos, Gerhard George Jansen, and Alex van Herk. The United Conservative Party's annual general meeting is coming up this Friday and Saturday in Red Deer. Organizers say it may be one of the largest ever attended, with over 5,000 members who may show up. Our legislative reporter, Tyler Dawson, says a number of policy issues will be discussed, including social issues and those that really impact our economy.
You have some of the things that I just mentioned, which is the economy, housing, affordability, potential income tax cut, things like that, that are sort of some of the bigger ideas that are out there that you are, or priority areas out there that you might think of as traditionally sort of small c conservative economic fiscal sort of issues. And then you have the convention, which has a lot of these social and cultural issues that are certainly part of the overall, conservative sort of policy handbook, but are also the things that really, really fire up a lot of members of the party's grassroots. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that needle is threaded, I guess. What are going to be the ideas that sort of animate this government moving forward, as opposed to the ideas that are animating the party's base? Is there going to be a pivot to some of the more economic stuff, more fiscal stuff? Or are we still going to see, as the party grassroots seems to prioritize, some of this more social, cultural stuff in the months ahead?
Mr. Tyler Dawson will also discuss how an Alberta MLA and a Liberal MP are fighting over a private member's bill involving pandemic preparedness. He'll have details coming up later in our show. BC Conservative leader John Rostad says he will look to topple David Eby's government if he continues to introduce policies that hurt the people of British Columbia.
Our job as the Conservative Party is to fight as hard as we can for the average everyday person in this province to try to improve their lives. And we'll be doing that whether it's in opposition to government or trying to force government's hand to be able to make sure that things get done to help people. There's an old saying in politics that you don't lose elections, you run out of time. And the unfortunate part is that we needed perhaps just more time to be able to connect, particularly with those people in the province that may not have heard the messaging and what we were trying to achieve in this province.
Rostad's BC Conservatives came very close to defeating the NDP in the October 19th election, winning 44 seats in the 93-seat legislature. Well, we enjoy quite a bit of sunshine today in Lethbridge. Jeanette Rocher is now with an early peek at the forecast. Jeanette, hopefully the sunshine will be sticking around for the next few days.
Well, yeah, it should be. And it was downright lovely out there today, wasn't it? Sunshine, we're looking at double-digit temperatures, hardly any wind, at least earlier in the day. Yeah, that's what I'm talking about. Now, as we get into Thursday, double digits? No, not so much. We're looking at a high of 7 degrees. Sunshine, though, we could see some increasing clouds throughout the day. And then for the evening, our little trick-or-treaters, they might have to wear some warmer clothes underneath those costumes. We are looking at an overnight low of -6. Shouldn't be there during trick-or-treating time, but still those temperatures should be kind of dwindling down closer to that 0 mark. But I'll be back later in the show to give you the 7-day forecast and also have a look at the national forecast.
Looking forward to it. Thanks so much, Jeanette. Well, it appears as though Lethbridge Polytechnic will be receiving $8 million less in funding in 2025, which may cause job losses at the post-secondary institution. Lethbridge Polytechnic, like other schools, is preparing to receive less international students, which means a potential loss in revenue. Now, the president and CEO of Lethbridge Polytechnic, Brad Donaldson, says Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada announced that they were going to reduce the number of student applications that would be received into Canada and distributed across the country, which will impact his group financially.
This impact won't happen until our next academic year. So this is from July 2025 going forward. So it's not an immediate impact. And we just floated the $8 million just to give a sense of what the potential could be. Now, we've got a lot of time between now and our next academic year to look at what we're going to do about it. And we're going to focus on increasing revenues. We're going to focus on finding new partnerships, those types of things, because our focus is still on growing the organization. This is a bit of an unanticipated speed bump that we've encountered, and we're going to find ways to mitigate that. We're looking at what programming would be best suited towards international students that can come here, so we can maximize the opportunity for those students to study here. Looking at different countries to recruit from, and just how do we reformulate our programming that makes it more attractive to domestic students as well, as we want to focus on student increases across all areas, not just international students. We want to make sure we're providing the right level of programs and opportunity for domestic students too. And international students pay a higher level of tuition because they've not contributed to the tax base, which helps our domestic students. So reducing the number of students internationally, or even domestically for that matter, would see a reduction in the revenues that we receive. And we have to look at ways to offset revenue losses in those areas with potential revenue increases in some other form of partnerships or increased programming.
Over the past 10 years, Lethbridge Polytechnic has welcomed students from 132 different nations. Lethbridge Polytechnic offers academic programs to international students, which enables them to be eligible for immigration programs. You know, drug and substance abuse is an issue that should concern all of us. Sometimes family members or others in our community continue to struggle to get out of that vicious cycle. Even if those who are battling addiction don't ask for help, they still need us. That's why a panel discussion on the opioid crisis was held Tuesday in Lethbridge. The event, called Collaboration of Service Providers, featured members of various community organizations. Roger Prairie Chicken, an elder with Indigenous recovery, is one of the panelists who says addiction doesn't just affect Indigenous people, it affects all of us.
It's just the same for the white people and for the ethnic people. They all come here because addictions is not just an Indian problem, it's First Nations, colored people, Chinese, white people. It's not just an Indian problem, it's a world problem. And that solution is working with the government and having a health hub. At the same time, when they leave the centers, when they finish coming up, they come back here, there's no services for them. There's no homes, there's no jobs. It goes back down to the truth of going back to the streets again. It's a vicious cycle.
We've taken corrective measures as best we can, to deal with the opioid crisis. Because prior to the opioid crisis, we prided ourselves in having the lowest per capita child welfare cases in the country. But the opioid crisis hit us head on, and we can no longer make those claims. So it's been devastating. So these kids go into a foster system or child welfare system, they're put at more risk. So it's imperative that we keep these kids home with their supports, with their family, to start ending these cycles.
According to researchers from the University of Calgary, since 2020, the number of opioid-related deaths in Alberta has risen to an average of more than 100 per month. Police with the Blood tribe say human remains were found in a wooded area northwest of the community of Laverne on Tuesday. Laverne is located on the Blood tribe nation. Police say the investigation is ongoing and no further information is being released at this time. Police are reminding families to be extra cautious when trick-or-treating this Halloween. October 31st can be particularly hectic on the roads, especially when the sun goes down so much earlier. RCMP Public Information Officer Troy Savinkoff discusses measures people can take to ensure that families can too enjoy Halloween without too many added risks.
The first thing we look at is road safety. You've got young children who are running around, crossing the road. They're very excited. They've got a lot of sugar in them. They may be forgetting to look both ways to cross the street. And that combined with the fact that you have parents that are driving their children around, there is increased traffic on roadways during Halloween. Nowadays, we do have those neon, shakeable tube light up things. Those are a nice little thing where you can talk about reflective material. But certainly if your child is in something dark or black, it is very difficult to see them, and you should make sure that they have something that other users of the road can see. When you're out trick-or-treating, maybe you could be bullied, your candy taken, so it's important, to consider doing it in groups, having a parent nearby trick-or-treating where there's other people. So larger groups certainly are safer. Drinking is always always something that we're concerned about. Impaired driving, and certainly during Halloween parties and so forth. This is where the real damage can happen to our society, is an impaired driver that goes out and takes a life. So really make sure, if you are going to those parties and you're watching, make sure you're being responsible. Make sure those around you are being responsible. If you do see somebody who's driving home intoxicated, please call 911.
Now, the folks at AMA also offered some Halloween safety tips, which include wearing face paint instead of masks to prevent obstructed vision, also to wear light-colored clothing and costumes for visibility. You can also pick up reflective armbands from any AMA location to make sure your children are more visible at night. The City of Lethbridge announced planned upgrades to Fritz Sick Pool on Tuesday that will increase accessibility. The upgrades include widened access points from the locker rooms to the pool deck, non-slip flooring, increased count in showers, and updated wheelchair ramps. The planned upgrades will close the pool beginning on November the 1st, with construction to last until February of next year. In the meantime, all programs usually held at Fritz Sick Pool will temporarily move to Stan Siwick and Nicholas Sharon pools.
The proximity of the Fritz Sick Center is central, as everybody is aware, to our city. So accessibility and the demographics that are able to use Fritz Sick is paramount, and so these upgrades are going to help a lot of people.
Right now, the change rooms have a bit of a maze as you try to get into them, which don't fit all types of wheelchairs and accessibility. So widening that space and streamlining it is allowing more entry to that space. And then same difference onto the pool deck. It's also a maze that you have to kind of go through. So that's huge, widening those doorways. And then with the floors, there's a non-slip floor going in, which is a big deal for all of our people that have, the senior demographic, mobility issues. It creates a safe space for everybody to use.
Officials say the renovations would require moving solid walls to create more room for the change rooms and lobby. Now, the price tag for all of the upgrades could amount to almost $900,000. We've already seen some snowfall this year in southern Alberta, so the question is, what's the forecast for this winter? Carol Conner, editor-in-chief of the Farmer's Almanac, gives us some insight into what kind of weather we can expect here in Alberta this winter.
We are saying wet, more precipitation overall, so it depends. If you get snow, you're going to see snow. I think it's kind of a sense of how warm will it be. I mean, all those cold snaps, that we're seeing really in the central part, really into the plains, all the way into, the U.S. That's what we're calling for the most snow. And then, yes, mild and wet pretty much everywhere else.
Wow, wet. Yeah, absolutely. Make sure you catch the full interview with Carol Conner from the Farmer's Almanac and BCN's Naveen Day coming up later in our program. Well, as for today, we enjoyed a mainly clear day across much of southwestern Alberta, and that should continue over the next couple of days. A full look at the weather picture is on deck. And it's been fairly mild here in Lethbridge, and that trend should continue for the trick-or-treaters on Thursday night. Jeanette Rocher is now with all of the weather details. Jeanette, no snow or rain in the forecast for those who'll be looking for candy fairly soon?
No snow, no rain, mainly clear skies. Not too bad temperatures as we're looking through the week there. Considering we are entering into November soon, we're sitting right in that seasonal range, which is pretty good. We're seeing a high of 7 degrees tomorrow on Thursday, mainly clear skies. Clear skies as well on Friday, high of 8 degrees. And then 2 for mainly cloudy skies on Saturday. Sunday looking at a high of 5 degrees. Back to double digits on Monday from 10 degrees. And then you can knock that in half there on Tuesday, high of only 5 degrees. But still positive because we are sticking within this seasonal range. Average high for this time of year right now, 8 degrees. Average low is -4. We're mostly hitting those in the overnight, early mornings. 24 was our record high on this day. That happened back in 1958. And in 1984, we were sitting at -23. Sun rose this morning at 8:18. sun set this evening at 6:11, so we're now seeing 9 hours and 53 minutes of daylight, 2 minutes shorter than we saw yesterday. And don't forget to turn those clocks back this weekend too. On the West Coast, Victoria was under a wind warning today as a strong Pacific frontal system was moving across the island, producing those strong winds up to 90 kilometers per hour. By tomorrow, though, those winds dying down to 20 k. Also mainly cloudy skies there, 11 for the high of 10 degrees in Vancouver with a chance of morning showers. Mix of sun and cloud across Alberta tomorrow, high 4. We're seeing a pair of 4s there in both Edmonton and Calgary tomorrow. As we look to the rest of the prairies, we're still seeing those chilly wind chill conditions in the morning, but raising up above 0 throughout the day. High of 7 degrees in Saskatoon tomorrow. Mainly sunny skies there, 8 in Regina and high of 5 degrees in Winnipeg tomorrow. As we look to the central part of the country, seeing 22. These are lovely temperatures, by the way, especially for Halloween. Toronto sitting at 22, 23 in Ottawa, and a lovely 22 degrees in Montreal tomorrow with clear skies to boot. As we get into the Maritimes, we're seeing a mix of sun and cloud in Fredericton, 21 for the high. Halifax seeing that chance of showers there, 18 for the high. Showers expected tomorrow in Charlottetown as well, 17 for the high. 2 to 4 millimeters of rain expected tomorrow in St. John's, and high of 7 degrees. So there you have it. That's your forecast.
Canada Post has presented its latest contract offer to the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Now, the new proposal includes annual wage increases amounting to 11.5% over 4 years. It also protects the defined benefit pension for current employees, along with job security and health benefits. The union announced earlier this week that its members voted overwhelmingly to support a strike if a deal could not be reached at the bargaining table. A U.S. bankruptcy judge has approved the sale of Tupperware brands that will clear the way for the iconic food storage company to exit Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. A group of lenders is buying Tupperware's brand name and various operating assets for $23.5 million U.S. in cash and more than $63 million U.S. in debt relief. The new Tupperware company will sell its products online along with a decades-old network of independent sales consultants. The sale approved by a Delaware court is still subject to closing conditions. A new poll by Leger says more than a quarter of Canadians expect to spend about $100 or more this Halloween. That total includes money for costumes, events, candy, and decorations. Now, the online survey, however, says not everyone will be dishing out the good stuff, the candy. Around 53% of those polled say they will not be dishing out any treats. More than a quarter of respondents say they will not spend a single dime on Halloween whatsoever. Now here's a look at today's markets.
The TSX was down 54 basis points of the day to 24,507. The Dow was also down 91 points to 42,141. The S&P 500 was down 19 points to 5,813. And the NASDAQ was down 104 points to 18,607. West Texas Intermediate oil was up $1.90 to $69.11 U.S. per barrel. Natural gas was down 4 cents to $2.81 U.S. Gold was up $28.66 to $2,773.10 U.S. an ounce, and silver was down 4 cents to $34.41 U.S. an ounce. Feed wheat is at $8.38 per bushel, barley is at $6.25, canola is $14.80, and corn is at $7.42 per bushel. Live cattle were down 90 cents to $188.40. Feeder cattle were down $2.18 to $264.48, and lean hogs December contract were up $1.55 to $84.38. And the Canadian dollar was up slightly over the past 24 hours and currently sits at $71.90 US.
Recapping one of our top stories, Bloc Québécois leader Yves-François Blanchet says his party will vote down the Liberal government after it missed the deadline for passing Bloc legislation on old age security pensions and supply management. Blanchet says time is up for the Justin Trudeau Liberals. There will be a leadership review of Alberta Premier Daniel Smith as the UCP is hosting its AGM in Red Deer beginning on Friday. Our legislative reporter Tyler Dawson will have details for us momentarily. When you see news happening in your community, be sure to drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. Also visit our website anytime to check out a number of stories and interviews. The UCP is hosting its annual general meeting in Red Deer this Friday and Saturday. A lot of policy ideas will be up for debate, along with the leadership review of Premier Daniel Smith. Now, joining us now to chit-chat a bit more about it is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, it sounds kind of unusual after winning a majority government that the party mandates reviews every 3 years, and this will be Daniel Smith's first one?
Yeah, it is a really weird situation. Leadership reviews are totally normal. You know, every party in the country goes through these, but normally you don't go through a leadership review after you've won a majority election. Obviously, the voters liked you. Why would caucus and party membership and whatnot turn around and evaluate them themselves? So it is a really strange situation, and the reason it's worked out like this is because the UCP's sort of governing rules say that there needs to be a review every 3 years. And so, of course, Danielle Smith became party leader in 2022. There was an election in 2023. This is sort of year 3, so to speak. And so she has to go through it. Now, I don't think anyone really expects her to lose. This is not like the leadership review of Jason Kenney. There's no real indication of dissent within caucus. There are certainly some people within the party and the grassroots and some of the sort of quasi-organized activist groups that we've heard so much about that are upset with Danielle Smith for various reasons. But nobody seems to be nearly as organized as they were during the Kenney years. There's no like overwhelming issue that's really fired up members of the party that could lead them to, you know, offer a really tepid show of support for Danielle Smith. So I don't expect any surprises from that. What is I think probably relevant about it, certainly in the folks in the party that I've talked to over the past week or two, is that, you know, to some extent this is a distraction. The UCP is in government right now. Its legislative agenda is sort of underway as of this week. There are all sorts of other issues across Alberta that they presumably want to pivot towards and tackle: affordability, healthcare, housing, those sorts of things. And yet there's, you know, this political imperative for the Premier and her supporters to make sure that she survives this leadership review on the weekend. And not only survives it, because of course Jason Kenney technically survived it too, with, you know, 51% or so of the vote, but also to survive it commandingly. So it's some of the folks I've talked to have said, oh, this is just a real distraction from the priorities that the party should be focused on. But, you know, come Monday, in theory, everyone's going to be pretty united behind the Premier and ready to get back to work.
Now let's talk about some of the policies up for debate, including one calling for the end of net zero emissions. Now the government say, you know, hey, it's important to recognize CO2. It's a building block for life and important for our plants. We need CO2 here.
Yeah, so there's a whole bunch of different policy proposals that are up for debate. I think it's probably fair to say that a lot of them have to do with sort of social and cultural issues. You know, there's bathroom use rules, more sort of pronoun use, parental rights sort of stuff. There is a lot of that circling around. There's a little bit of sort of bread and butter conservative policy ideas, you know, for opposing the carbon tax. I mean, of course, like there's never going to be a United Conservative Party convention where there's a resolution in favor of a carbon tax. And the net zero one, as you mentioned, which is slightly unusual because of its focus on sort of, I guess, the benefits, you might say, of carbon dioxide, as opposed to the opposition to the net zero policy idea that the federal government has. So I think what is happening here is you have this, some of the things that I just mentioned, which is the economy, housing, affordability, potential income tax cut, things like that, that are sort of some of the bigger ideas that are out there that you are, or priority areas out there that you might think of as traditionally sort of small c conservative economic fiscal sort of issues. And then you have the convention, which has a lot of these social and cultural issues that are certainly part of the overall, you know, conservative sort of policy handbook, but are also the things that really, really fire up a lot of members of the party's grassroots, especially a lot of the new members. I'm not talking about the people, you know, who were maybe Wild Rosers 20 years ago or PC voters 20 years ago, but some of the new, really animated people who came in sort of during the pandemic and the years following. And part of the issue from some of the folks I've talked to is that that is the stuff, the social cultural stuff that ends up making the headlines, is obviously stuff the NDP wants to hear about because they'd love to campaign on some of those conservative policies, or against those conservative policies, I should say. So it's going to be kind of interesting to see how that needle is threaded, I guess. What are going to be the ideas that sort of animate this government moving forward, as opposed to the ideas that are animating the party's base? Is there going to be a pivot to some of the more economic stuff, more fiscal stuff? Or are we still going to see, as the party grassroots seems to prioritize, some of this more social cultural stuff in the months ahead? And I would posit that some of the social cultural stuff is going to be a harder sell for the UCP over the next few years. But it's going to be interesting to see how they weigh the both sides of that scale.
I'm glad you brought up the social issues. What do you envision as some of the more hot button topics that will be discussed at the AGM?
Yeah. Well, it's hard to say, right? Because it's not like there's a massive amount of disagreement within the UCP on some of these issues. I think some of the parental rights, some of the pronoun stuff that we've seen in the last couple of years, it has been a little bit controversial at the AGM, but not in the way that it's been controversial, say, more broadly. When the provincial government, or when Danielle Smith last January, I think it would have been, announced that there was going to be the pronoun policy in schools, there was going to be a restriction on some of the medical options available to transgender minors. The NDP and some of the sort of activist community said, well, this is an attack on transgender people. This is going to put kids in danger, et cetera, et cetera. Now, at the UCP convention, you're not likely to hear that. You may hear a little bit of it, but you're not likely to hear that much of it. What you're more likely to hear in terms of how it's controversial in that room is, do we want to open ourselves up to an attack from the NDP on this? Is this the sort of thing that is going to win over voters in urban areas where we've lost a lot of ground in the last couple of years? I think the concerns on that front tend to be a little more tactical than they are, points of principle, let's say, that might animate some of the opponents to those policies. So I don't actually expect anything to be wildly controversial. Not internally. I certainly expect some of those to be controversial once these are broader public and the NDP get their eyes on them.
So maybe more the focus of the AGM will be on the economy, affordability, healthcare, education, some of the more broad topics, I guess, that are impacting a lot of Albertans as well. Now, Tyler, the Alberta government is also asking the federal court for a judicial review of Ottawa's decision around the exemption to the carbon tax of home heating oil. I know you and I have talked about this in the past. It largely impacts a lot of Atlantic Canada. But many of us here in the West don't use oil. We use natural gas, not just here in the West, but in central Canada as well.
Yeah, that's right. And so obviously the carbon tax is still on, the natural gas you use for heating. I suppose if you converted your home to home heating oil, you'd get an exemption, but I can't imagine that would be worth it for the, $40 a month you'd save. Yeah, so the basic argument is this. The idea is that the carbon tax, which was found constitutional by the Supreme Court, I think it's worth clarifying that it was supposed to be a matter of fairness. Instead of having a patchwork of environmental policies across the country, a patchwork of, say, carbon tax or cap and trade schemes across the country, the federal carbon tax was sort of a streamlining backstop standard that everywhere across the country was supposed to follow. By carving out this exemption for home heating oil, which is sort of a de facto exemption for Atlantic Canada because it's so overwhelmingly used there compared to the rest of the country, the Alberta government's basically going to argue that, look, this is no longer fair. This has been a discriminatory discriminatory, let's use that, policy that is deliberately targeting one part of the country while exempting another part of the country, potentially for sort of crass political reasons, because of course the Liberals have a lot of seats in Atlantic Canada and are hopeful of hanging on to them in the next election. So that's sort of the thrust of this. And of course, the carbon tax has not been popular in Alberta for a long time. Even the NDP has sort of come around on opposing it. But the one thing that I would flag on it that I also find notable is that Naheed Nenshi, in his statement yesterday, said, well, does Danielle Smith not think that Pierre Poilievre's going to win the next federal election? Why would you spend all this money on a legal fight when the carbon tax is going to be gone in a year? Which I think is a worthwhile point to make. By the time the federal court does its judicial review of this, perhaps it goes to the Supreme Court. I mean, the possibility exists that we will have a new federal government before this court challenge is ever actually fully dealt with. So an interesting line of attack, I think, from Nenshi on that one, who of course is a new NDP leader and trying to make some waves here.
Now, Tyler, on Monday, the first bill of the legislative session was to update the Bill of Rights. Now, this is not a proper constitutional document, so it really has limited power, correct?
Yeah, it's sort of it's a statutory rights document. So it basically created or expanded on four rights. It's changing the idea of freedom of speech to freedom of expression, because of course you can have forms of expression that aren't, just verbal or written. It's expanding, in theory, firearms rights. It's protecting against unwanted medical procedures, whether that's vaccination or any other treatment, with, of course, the exception most likely of forced or involuntary treatment for drug addiction. And the last right that it's expanding that I'm completely blanking on. Property rights. Thank you, Hal. There it is. Property rights. Yeah. It'll also make it more difficult for the province to expropriate property. So what could happen in any of these situations is the NDP could win the next election and say, well, we don't actually like that bit about medical treatment, and they could just amend it, as the UCP is doing right now. The NDP could amend it if they so wanted. If they lost a court case, the UCP could amend the statute. So they could amend the Bill of Rights, or they could amend the impugned legislation. So in that sense, it has slightly limited effect. Now, it does, however, have effect in the sense that a court could use the Bill of Rights to invalidate provincial legislation or put a stop to provincial actions. It will not in any way affect the federal government, which is really notable on the firearms front, because firearms law is primarily a matter of federal law. And it won't, of course, affect the private sector either. So it'll basically be government and some sort of government-adjacent bodies. So perhaps universities, hospitals, the RCMP in Alberta, the police in Alberta, municipalities in Alberta. So it could have an effect, certainly, but it hasn't really been used. I mean, it's been on the books since 1972, 73. It has been used on occasion, but generally speaking, people who are fighting in court over civil liberties, they do tend to use the charter anyways. So it'll be very interesting to see if this actually becomes any more than a symbolic gesture. Is this going to become part of the sort of judicial battle kit, shall we say?
Alberta's Agriculture Minister R.J. Sigurdsson and Liberal MP Nathaniel Erskine-Smith are fighting a little bit right now, Tyler, and it has something to do with Erskine-Smith backing a private member's bill calling on the government to create a pandemic preparedness and prevention plan?
It's a really sort of confusing situation, actually. So yeah, there's this private member's bill that would call on the federal government to work in concert with the provincial governments to create a pandemic preparedness and prevention plan. Say that 10 times fast. It's a real mouthful. And it's in the Senate right now. And part of what this plan or proposal for a plan would do is try to, create some safety or additional safety or safeguards around sort of commercial food processing facilities. Now, R.J. Sigurdsson, the agriculture minister, said that this seems like a plan to sort of destroy Alberta's cattle and pork industry, saying that, they could shut down meat processing plants on a whim and things like that. And Erskine-Smith says, well, no, this is a plan to create a plan. This is not setting out any specific thing that the government could do. So it's a sort of a strange war of the words, because it isn't a plan yet. It's a proposal for a plan with some ideas about how that plan should come into effect. But nevertheless, some of the ranchers and meat producers in the province are not happy about it, and Sigurdsson is clearly backing them. And Erskine-Smith said he was sort of baffled by the whole thing. So, whatever the truth of the matter is in there, it is perhaps a matter more of trying to find fights to pick with the federal government and vice versa than it is anything to do with the specifics of what's going on here.
Tyler, Premier Daniel Smith has warned that our province could be headed for a budget deficit. Now, didn't government officials say that Alberta would have a surplus heading into 2025?
Yeah, I think as recently as August, they were saying that at the end of the, what would it have been, third quarter fiscal update. It was going to be a small surplus all along, $367 million or something like that, and also largely a paper surplus, because I never really understood the paper surplus thing, but it sort of has to do with accounting books as opposed to sacks of gold in the treasury, I think. But the issue basically is the issue that every Alberta government has faced for like 40 years, which is that a lot of the revenue we get is from royalty resource revenue. resource royalties, I should say. Got that totally backwards. And the oil prices aren't doing quite as well as forecasted or hoped for. And so when they do the budget process, they try and guess low. They don't make their budget plans based on $100 barrel of oil. They hope for $100 barrels, but plan for a lot less than that. And those numbers have been not quite as good even as they had hoped. So that could make for a budgetary challenge coming up next year. Now, of course, they want to be seen as fiscally responsible heading towards the next election in 2027. They don't want to have to raise taxes. In fact, they have promised an income tax cut, which they have deferred because of the budgetary situation. So it could actually affect some of the UCP's promises, I think. And also, of course, going all the way back to some of the stuff we talked about right at the beginning about fiscal responsibility. I mean, there are still some old school Wild Rosers and old school PCers who want to see pretty strict fiscal discipline, surpluses every year, tax cuts, things like that. So it does put them in a bit of a sticky position. But of course, it's the position that any other party would be in as well at this point, I would imagine.
Naheed Nenshi still doesn't have a seat at the legislature, Tyler. Do we know when and where he's going to run for a seat? Will an NDP MLA potentially be stepping down in an NDP-friendly riding, perhaps maybe in Edmonton, where you are?
Well, that's normally how it would work. Yeah. In this case, normally someone, sort of sacrifices themselves in order for the leader to run in their riding. And they usually do try and pick a relatively safe riding. I mean, Naheed Nenshi is not about to run in Peace River to try and win a seat in the legislature. And so Premier Danielle Smith, who of course has this other by-election, the one in Lethbridge West, that she needs to call a date for, has sort of said, well, I want to do both of them at the same time because it costs money to run an election and it would save money if we could do them simultaneously and so on. And then she hasn't really bitten. So it's actually really not clear what's going on there. When Jagmeet Singh first became leader of the federal NDP, there was some argument that he should sort of try and stay out of the fray of the House because, it's not always the most edifying spectacle in question period and things like that. So there is the possibility that Nenshi is thinking the same thing. He can maybe remain outside, maybe remain aloof, try and build up his brand across Alberta before getting into the sort of cut and thrust of legislative politics. But of course, he's not in the legislature. He's not sitting there. He's not getting clips responding in the House and all those sorts of things. So it is an odd situation, and there's really no indication. And of course, the most likely thing, logical thing, would be for him to run in Calgary, because of course that's his hometown. That's where he was mayor. It's where, as far as I'm aware, anyways, he lives. But of course, it's also a higher risk area for him. He would, be at much less risk of losing, say, if he were to run in, say, Rachel Notley's riding if she stepped down. Which she may do, but she also has not given any indication that she will. So it's a big old shoulder shrug. We just don't really know at the moment what Nenshi is planning on doing, and maybe more to the point, also don't know what the tactical reasoning is behind that.
Only time will tell. He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent with the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks so much for joining us today from Edmonton.
Always a pleasure, Hal.
A lot of folks enjoy reading the Old Farmer's Almanac, and some swear by its famous weather predictions. Joining us today to chat more about this is Carol Conair. She is the editor-in-chief of the Old Farmer's Almanac Canadian edition. Carol, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Bridge City News.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So let's get started. For anyone not familiar with your publication, how would you best describe the Old Farmer's Almanac?
Oh, old and new. We have the old in our name, but we have tons of new stuff every year. So I think that's what's kept us around for 233 years, is that we have this great blend of tried and true, but also what is the newest stuff out there? What are we curious about?
233 years. Wow, that's really impressive. So let's talk about the weather now, and let's get right into the nitty-gritty. Bad news first. You say cold for Ontario and eastern Manitoba?
Ooh, you're really one of the few areas in North America we're seeing snow cover and cold most of the winter season. That's what our prediction is.
And Saskatchewan won't have the mountains of snow, but some cold temperatures?
Absolutely. I was looking, and the cold snaps are so frequent. We're saying, let me read my notes here, early and late December, early and late January, and mid and late February. That's kind of all winter.
Wow. And now southern Alberta, which is where we are right now, let's talk about your prediction there as well as southern BC. Also below average temperatures, but it's interesting that you predict that the very southern areas of Alberta, which is where we are, we will have a wet winter that isn't so cold.
We are saying wet, more precipitation overall. So it depends. If you get snow, you're going to see snow. I think it's kind of a sense of how warm will it be. I mean, all those cold snaps, that we're seeing really in the central part, really into the plains, all the way into, the U.S. That's what we're calling for the most snow. And then, yes, mild and wet pretty much everywhere else. As you go further east, there are some drier spots in Canada, but even as you go out to the Maritimes, wet again.
So then let's talk about the Maritimes and Quebec. And what's the outlook for Quebec, Newfoundland, and the other maritime provinces?
All the way east, we're saying really, really wet and precipitation. But if you're going inland, as you go inland, there's the chance for more snow. But yeah, it's a milder winter overall, really, for North America, except for kind of the very heart of our landmass, where we'll see cold. It's because of the jet stream. It's wavier, it's slower, and those cold blasts have a good shot at coming down quite a few times during the winter.
Now, it seems that there's some times where the Old Farmer's Almanac and what, say, like Environment Canada would predict, or like what they forecast, kind of clash. Are there different models that the Old Farmer's Almanac uses? Maybe you could explain some of that.
Oh, absolutely. Well, we're kind of crazy, right? Trying to predict long range weather over a year in advance when people trying to predict it tomorrow don't always get it right. So there's that. But I think the main thing that differentiates us from pretty much all other long range weather forecasting is how much emphasis we put on magnetic storms on the sun. Those solar storms. Lots of people further south than ever before seeing the aurora borealis. That's the cycles of storms on the sun. It's hitting its peak. It just is peak of 25, and then the cycle 26. Those are 11-year cycles, and we have 25 years of records, which is an incredible set of data. And so it's not like magnetic storm, hot summer, right? It affects many, many aspects of what affects our weather. But what we are able to do is go back through time and layer that incredible information on top of climate science and meteorology and just look for those patterns. And that is essentially what we do with our long range forecasting.
And let's talk a little bit more about those solar storms, because North America has been treated to some really wonderful, spectacular light shows up in the sky this year, and most recently in the last couple of weeks. How are these solar storms impacting our climate or our way of living? Is it causing any disruptions with technology, cell phones, anything like that? Anything that you could share on these solar storms?
Sure. Well, this has just been an incredibly active end to a cycle, really a record breaker in that way. And typically what happens, after the peak, it will rest down. The magnetic storms will dissipate on the sun. And yes, we have seen, I don't think most recently we've seen this, but in some of those intense storms earlier this year, there's little bits of the grid that might get a blast and knock out. And so we do see some impacts that way. I think overall, the weather patterns that we're seeing that, partially are caused by this magnetic cycle on the sun, just a whole lot more water in the atmosphere, right? These tropical storms are dumping more water when they come onto land, and also really short duration but heavy rainfall where we've seen some of that flooding, and so that intensity is part of this cycle. So hopefully, now that we're going to be past peak on those storms, we'll move into a quieter time weather-wise.
Well, that's great to hear. I'm sure the people down south will be pleased to hear that they're not going to see such intense hurricanes like we saw some record-breaking hurricanes this year.
Right, we hope.
We hope. Now, last year when we interviewed Jack Burnett, he's the managing editor of the Old Farmer's Almanac, he said we could expect to see a dry winter last winter. How accurate were last year's predictions?
Well, we was really accurate around where I am, and we do our accuracy in every issue. You can look in every issue, and we list cities, and so you can see where you are. You know, if you find a city close to you, how we did. So it really is dependent on where you are. You know, we might get 100% in your area, and really be on the nose, precipitation and temperature. Lots of places. 2 years ago, for instance, we had a lot of indiscrepancies with that precipitation. There was just a lot more generally, and so our forecast to take that into consideration and look more closely at that. And again, with a warming world, we're just continually having to tweak our temperatures up. Canada released almost all of its new normals. The US did a few years ago. So we're working on a later data set, 1990 to 2020 or so. But even those aren't quite capturing because of the two warmest summers really on record this year and last.
Now, the Old Farmer's Almanac is not just about weather. It also includes a variety of interesting articles. Can you share a bit about the endangered cattle breeds? Because I had no idea about this.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite stories. Comeback cows. Yes, and so we were looking at cattle breeds that are really making a comeback in Canada. There's a Speckle Park is a breed from let's see, that's from Alberta, right? And so things that we've learned about these breeds is that they have a lot of resiliency, just like heirloom tomatoes. Say they might be more resistant to blight. Well, these animals, heritage breeds, often had to do three things: plow, make milk, and feed the owner. And so those are really wonderful qualities today, and we're finding they might have natural resistance to things like hoof disease, or just be able to survive on a better variety of feed that isn't a monoculture. So lots of advantages with these heritage breeds, and the fact that Canadian breeders are bringing them back so successfully is a great news story.
And you also take a look at whether planet Earth is on a collision course with a collection of space rubble?
Right, I wrote that one. Yeah, Bennu. I became, let's say, fascinated by this near asteroid. It's not going to hit us, so that's the good news. Jazz hands. But what's really cool about it is it's very close to us. And last September, we went and we came back with dirt from it. And so this incredible set of studies is going on now. And the interesting thing about Bennu is that it was likely created very close to when the Earth was created. So we can get some information there, more information hopefully about the creation of our own planet, because this has been hanging around for 400 million years and has got some of the same stuff that we do.
Okay, so that's good news. There's no giant asteroid heading towards Earth. There's no Armageddon situation here, because I don't even know if Bruce Willis and Ben Affleck are available for that. Now, many of us are cat lovers. Not me, I'm team dog. But there's an article on understanding and interpreting the curious behaviors of cats. Can you share some examples of some strange behaviors and what they actually mean?
Right. Well, I can't give away all of our secrets, but it's a wonderful story. Yeah, cats, you know how they knead or making biscuits, it's called. What is that for? There's a few reasons. They might, sometimes it's just a stress relief thing. It's a natural thing for them to exercise their paws. What is catnip really doing? We tell you about that. Blepping is this sort of like little thing they do with their tongue. Again, several reasons. It might be a stress thing. It might be just some fun they're having. So we give you lots of those facts about cats. We kind of had to do that because we did dogs a few years ago, and the cat lovers, as you well know, we heard from them. So there's our cats.
So when the cat is doing this is called making biscuits?
Yeah, making biscuits.
Where did that come from?
Yeah. I know, right? Cat lovers have a lot of time on their hands to say cute things.
And I also heard when a cat, like, say, brings you like a dead animal, it actually doesn't think you're eating enough, and so it's trying to help you. Is that true?
Yeah, and it's very proud of its catch. Like, they're hunters, right? So they want their owner to know, look what I got for you. You shouldn't be so hungry all the time.
That's interesting, because we were just talking about that in the office the other day too, about when a cat brings you a dead animal. Now, I also noticed that the Old Farmer's Almanac has a set of tables to follow for planting crops and veggies. And apparently moon cycles can have effect on growth. Tell me more about that.
Absolutely. So, well, where you are, you probably don't see too many tides, but the truth is, we know that the moon affects water, affects our oceans, but it also affects water we can't see. The ground has water in it. Plants are 90% water. We're about 60% water. And so, what's that doing? And the idea, of course, in 1792, every other person was a farmer, and boy, they wanted any leg up, to make sure their crops worked. And our founder, Robert B. Thomas, was an astronomer. And like many, he looked to the sky for reasons and seasons, and the idea about the moon. So it's very simple in a nutshell. If you are growing above ground crops, things that really need to do their business above ground, like lettuces and corn or beans, peas, things that climb, do that in a waxing moon as the moon is growing in its intensity of light, because the water's being drawn up. And a waning moon, right? A waning moon, now the water comes back down right into the earth. So root crops, you want to transplant something, your garlic, your onions, potatoes, beets, those things are underground. And so it's helpful. The water being drawn back into the earth by the moon receding in light, right? In the waning, lets those crops really dig in.
That's really interesting, because I have a few plants around my home, and I water them, but sometimes they just don't survive. And I think that's the reason why I don't have kids, is because if I can't make a plant survive, what chances do I have with a kid? But maybe I should read the Old Farmer's Almanac and get some tips on how to take care of the plants in my home.
I think we can definitely tell you how to take care of plants, but we're not going to tell you how to take care of kids. Though in a lot of historic almanacs, we do talk about parenting, but I don't think as the editor I would touch that one right now.
Okay, and then in our last couple minutes here, what is the overall Canadian summer weather prediction looking like?
Oh, it's different in a few different places. We're calling for the U.S. hot and dry, and so parts of Canada the same. But again, it's kind of depends on where you are. Some of the coastal areas are going to be seeing more rain than others, and I think the further north you go, we have some rain predictions there. But overall, where you are, we're calling for a cool and wet summer in the Alberta area.
Great. Carol Conaire is the editor-in-chief of the Old Farmer's Almanac Canadian Edition, available at www.almanac.com. Carol, thank you so much for sharing these interesting stories and weather predictions with us.
Thanks for having us.
I'm Naveen Day. On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, thanks for watching.